Alabama's murderer Daniel Siebert used the method of stabbing and strangulation to kill 9 to 12 students between 1979 and 1986. He was sentenced to death row but later died in prison. In Alaska, Robert Hansen used the method of shooting to kill 174 females in Alaskan wilderness between 1973 and 1983. He was sentenced to life in prison and later died in prison. In Arizona, Douglas Brettler used the method of shooting. He killed between 9 and 17 people. He bound, shot, and robbed them. It was between October and November in 1973. His sentence was lethal injection. Arkansas. James Hall, known as Big Jim, used the method of shooting and murdered 4 people. He murdered his wife and 3 men in robberies. It was between 1944 and 1945. He was sentenced to the electric chair. In California, Shuang Corona, known as the Machete Murderer, used shooting, stabbing, and bludgeoning to murder 25 workers between 1960 and 1971. He was sentenced to the electric chair. Colorado. Vincent Rosie used a method of strangulation to kill 174 targeted prostitutes between 1978 and 1988. He was sentenced to life in prison but later died in prison. Connecticut. William Howe, known as the Sick Ripper, used a method of strangulation. He targeted 7 women and buried them behind a shop. This happened in 2003 and he was given life in prison. Delaware. Stephen, known as the Route 40 Killer, used a method of strangulation, stabbing, and bludgeoning. He killed 5 women who he lured, tortured, and killed them. This was between 1978 and 1988. His sentence was the lethal injection. Florida. Bobby Long, known as the classified ad rapist, used the method of strangulation. He found 10 victims by answering ads in the classifieds. He did this between May and November in 1984 and was sentenced to death row. Georgia. Wayne Williams used the method of strangulation. His victims were Atlantic kids who he murdered despite evidence which he denies being involved in. This was between 1979 and 1981. He received life in prison. Hawaii. The Honolulu Strangler used the method of strangulation. He killed 5 victims, which the killer's real identity remains unknown but suspicious. In 1985 to 1986, no sentence has been passed as the killer has been unfound, but there are suspicions. Idaho. James Watson, known as Bluebeard, bludgeoned and drowned his victims. He had 25 victims and he murdered them around his marriages. Between 1918 and 1920, he was sentenced to life in prison but later died in prison. Illinois. John Gacy Jr., known as the Killer Clown, used a method of strangulation. He has apparently murdered 33 people through his construction business and clowning at local events. This was between 1972 and 1978. He was sentenced to the lethal injection. Indiana. Larry Eager, known as the Highway Killer, used the method of stabbing. He murdered 23 victims, dismembering them and dumping them on the interstate. He did this during 1982 to 1984. He was given life in prison but later died in prison. Iowa. Carroll Cole used a method of strangulation and drowning. He had 15 victims altogether, and his first was at 10 years old when he drowned a boy. He killed people in 1948, 1971, and then up to 1980. His sentence was a lethal injection. Kansas. Dennis Rader, known as the bind, torture, kill killer. His method of killing was strangulation and stabbing. His victims were bind, tortured, and then killed. He killed around 10 people between 1974 and 1991. His sentence was life in prison. Kentucky. Donald Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, used the method of poisoning. He killed between 37 and 57 people. He killed patients in a hospital out of empathy. Between 1970 and 1987, his sentence was life in prison.